coffee was still hot when Daniel Mercer pulled into the school parking lot. That was the thing about mornings, they had a rhythm. 6:15 alarm, shower, shirt, the same gray tie he'd worn 3 times that week. 7 eggs scrambled in the small pan his wife had picked out 4 years before she stopped coming home. Toast for Lily. Juice in the dinosaur cup. Backpack by the door the night before. Because Lily forgot things if they weren't already there. Waiting. He was not a complicated man. He parked the car and turned around. Lily was in the back seat, both hands wrapped around her juice box, watching him with those serious gray eyes she'd inherited from his mother. "You have your reading folder?" he said. She held it up without a word. "Good girl." He got out and opened her door, and she took his hand the way she always did, both hands, all at once, like she was holding on to something she didn't want to lose. She was 6. She still ran to doors. She still believed that the right stuffed animal on your pillow kept bad dreams away. He had not yet learned what she had already seen. Whitmore Technologies occupied 4 floors of a glass building on the east side of the financial district, and Daniel had worked there for 9 years. He was a systems infrastructure manager, the kind of job that sounded important at dinner parties, but mostly meant he spent his days keeping other people's mistakes from becoming disasters. He was good at it. Quiet, methodical, patient in a way that had been beaten into him not by management training but by single parenthood. He had taken the job when Lily was 9 months old, and his wife, Claire, was still trying to make the marriage work by staying away from it. The position had offered stability, good salary, predictable hours, the kind of institutional solidity that felt important when you had a daughter who needed a pediatrician and a reliable school schedule. He had never left because inertia was part of it, but so was genuine capability. He was, objectively, excellent at what he did. He had a small office on the 3rd floor. Glass walls on 2 sides, a standing desk he never actually stood at, and a framed drawing Lily had made of the 2 of them holding hands under a sun with 8 rays. He had taped it to the monitor at first, then bought a frame for it, which had felt like an admission of something tender that he chose not to examine too closely. The office was, as far as he knew, entirely his. He had decorated it the way careful, practical men decorate spaces, meaning he had put the drawing on the wall and left everything else to be defined by function. There was the monitor, the mechanical keyboard his college roommate had convinced him to buy, and which he had begrudgingly come to love, a small succulent on the windowsill that Lily had named Gerald, and which he watered every Thursday with the same regularity he applied to system patches. He dropped his bag and opened his laptop and began the daily ritual of reviewing overnight system logs. Tuesday. Nothing unusual. A patch deployment had completed cleanly at 3 a.m. The analytics cluster was running 7% above baseline, which he flagged for the morning stand-up. He answered 3 emails, reviewed a ticket that had been sitting in the queue since Friday, and made a note to follow up on a storage capacity issue that was not urgent but would become urgent if left unaddressed, which was the kind of thing he knew because it had happened before, and because he had an accurate mental model of how systems degraded when no one was watching them carefully. He was good at watching carefully. Down the hall, through the glass, he could see Marcus Webb already at his desk talking on the phone, tie loosened before 9, gesturing with a coffee cup like he was conducting something. Marcus was a senior architect, 2 years Daniel's junior in tenure, but 3 levels above him in the informal hierarchy that actually governed the office, the kind of man who remembered every favor he'd ever done and kept a running ledger. They were not exactly friends. They were the kind of colleagues who ate lunch together twice a month and called it a relationship. Daniel watched him for a moment, then went back to his logs. Nothing about that morning felt like a last morning, but Lily had been quiet at breakfast, quieter than usual. She'd eaten her toast in the careful, deliberate way she sometimes did when something was sitting heavy inside her. He'd asked if everything was okay, and she'd said yes, Daddy, and looked out the window, and he had been in a hurry, and he had believed her. He should have stayed longer. He should have asked again. At 11:15, Marcus knocked on his door and said there was a call with Singapore that needed Daniel's input on the new data routing architecture. Daniel stood, straightened his tie, picked up his laptop. The routine of a normal Tuesday. He did not know that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, his badge would be deactivated. The meeting had 37 minutes of normal in it before the room changed. Daniel was explaining redundancy protocols to the Singapore team when Harriet Voss walked in. She was the Chief Information Security Officer, a compact woman in her late 50s, with silver hair cropped close, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, over a long career, that alarm was a luxury she could not afford. She did not sit down. She said, "Daniel, I need you to step out." The Singapore team would later say they thought it was a technical emergency. That was the tone. That specific brand of calm that lives just on the other side of urgency. He followed her into the hallway. Richard Albright, the CEO, was standing at the end of it. Richard was a tall man with a handshake he'd clearly practiced and a habit of maintaining eye contact slightly too long. He was not alone. There was a woman from legal, whose name Daniel would never learn. And there was the head of HR. And there was a man in a plain dark suit whom no one introduced. "Daniel," Richard said. "Come into the conference room." He sat across from 5 people and listened to them describe, in careful succession, a catastrophe. 48 hours ago, a tranche of encrypted client data had been exfiltrated from Whitmore's secure infrastructure. Financial records. Proprietary algorithmic models. The kind of thing that, in the wrong hands, was worth between $12 and $20 million on the secondary market. The breach had been traced through 3 layers of log files. The access tokens had resolved to a single source. His account. He had, according to their records, initiated a remote session at 11:47 p.m. on Sunday. He had accessed 3 restricted file repositories using an admin override that required a secondary authentication code. He had compressed the files. He had transmitted them through an encrypted tunnel to an external endpoint. He had done none of these things. He had been asleep at 11:47 p.m. on Sunday. He had been home. He had tucked Lily in at 9, watched 30 minutes of something forgettable on the couch, and been in bed by 10:30. "I wasn't in the office," he said. "The session was remote," Harriet said. "I wasn't on my laptop. I was at home. Check my home network logs." "Your home network," said the woman from legal, "uses a VPN provided by Whitmore, routed through our infrastructure. The session could have originated from your home and still be consistent with what we're seeing." He looked at each of them in turn. 5 faces arranged in careful neutrality. Richard said, "We're placing you on administrative suspension, effective immediately. Your access credentials have been revoked. Security will escort you from the building." "Richard, this is not a punishment, Daniel. It's a process. You'll be contacted by legal within 48 hours. He wanted to say something. He was not a man who said things in moments like that. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He thanked them, which in retrospect he could not explain. Old habit, the automatic courtesy of a man who had always believed that politeness was load-bearing. The woman from legal handed him a single sheet of paper. He took it and read it. It outlined his rights during administrative suspension, the timeline of the investigation, and the procedures by which he could seek legal representation. It was the same sheet, he would later realize, that had been printed and waiting before he walked into the room. Before the meeting had started, before, even, he had been called in from the Singapore call. Someone in that building had known this morning exactly how it would end. The security guard was a young man named Grant, who had once asked Daniel for help setting up his router. He walked Daniel to the elevator and down to the lobby and out through the glass doors without saying anything, which was the kindest thing he could have done. Sitting in his car in the parking garage, Daniel stared at the concrete wall in front of him for 4 minutes. Then he drove to pick up Lily. She was waiting on the bench outside her classroom, knees together, lunchbox on her lap, watching the parking lot entrance with the focused attention of a child who has been watching for someone. When she saw his car, her face did something complicated, relief, and underneath it, something darker, something that had been sitting there all day. He signed her out. He buckled her in. He did not tell her what had happened. He drove to the park 3 blocks from their house. The one with the red slide she had decided was too babyish for her at 5 and had reconsidered at 6. They sat on the bench by the swing set. She picked a piece of mulch off her shoe, set it down, picked up another one. He said, "You were quiet at breakfast." She said, "I know." He waited. He had learned, with Lily, that waiting was the whole skill. She was a child who processed things at her own speed and came out the other side with sentences that sometimes stopped him cold. She was not like other 6-year-olds he'd met, whose feelings moved across their faces like weather. Lily kept things in. She observed first. She sorted internally, and when she finally spoke about something that mattered, she was precise in a way that both moved him and occasionally scared him, because it was the kind of precision that came from paying close attention to a world she wasn't always sure was safe. She had been this way since she was 3. Since the last time Claire had come to take her for a weekend and had called at 6 on Sunday to say she couldn't make it after all. He had found Lily sitting on the floor of her bedroom with a book in her lap, not reading, just sitting. She'd looked up when he came in and said, very quietly, "Mommy isn't coming." Not a question. A fact she had already processed. He had sat on the floor with her. He had not said the things you were supposed to say in that moment. "It'll be okay. She loves you. She's just busy." He had sat there and put his arm around her small shoulders and said, "I'm here." That was all. She had leaned into him and gone back to her book. He thought about that moment sometimes. He thought about it now, on this bench, watching her study the mulch in her fingers. "Daddy," she said, "is there a recording thing in your office?" He went still. "What do you mean, a recording thing?" She looked at the mulch in her fingers. "Like a little one. That you put somewhere." His heart was making itself known in a way hearts usually have the courtesy not to. "Why are you asking about that, Lily?" She was quiet for another 7 seconds. He counted. "Because," she said carefully, "I saw a man put one there." He crouched down so he was level with her. This was something he did when what she was saying mattered. And she knew it. "Tell me what you saw." It came out in pieces, the way 6-year-old memory always does, not linear, not certain, but with the particular specificity that children have for details that scared them. 3 weeks ago, she had come to the office after school. Mrs. Parrish, who usually watched her on Wednesdays, had a family thing, and his regular backup had fallen through, and Lily had sat in the small chair in his office for an hour while he finished a deployment. He had stepped out to the server room. He had been gone maybe 12 minutes. When he came back, Lily was standing in the doorway of his office, not inside it. She said she'd gone to get water, and when she came back, there was a man in his office. "He was by your desk," she said, "by the thing on the wall, the white thing, the cable management panel. Behind his monitor. A recessed panel in the wall where network cables ran, with a small access door that was almost never opened." What did the man look like? She described him, and then she said the thing that went through him like cold water. "He told me not to tell. He said you'd be in trouble if I told anyone. He said it was a surprise for you." She looked up. Her eyes were very serious. "But it didn't feel like a surprise, Daddy. It felt bad." He said, "You were right. It did feel bad." He said it very quietly. "You are so smart. And you did the right thing, telling me." She leaned against his arm. He sat there in the park while a pair of sparrows argued over something near the water fountain, and he understood with a clarity that arrived all at once, the way some things do, that he had not made a mistake. He had been chosen. He waited until 11 p.m. Lily was asleep. He'd checked her twice, watched the small architecture of her breathing, made sure the nightlight was on. He left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Back by midnight. Love, Dad," because he was the kind of father who left notes. He still had his parking access card. They had revoked his system credentials, but facility access was managed by a separate system, one he knew, because he had helped implement it, that updated on a 24-hour batch cycle. His badge would stop working at midnight. He had, if he needed it, 53 minutes. He drove with the radio off. The building was not empty at night. There was always a security guard at the main desk. Tonight, it was a man named Terrence, who worked nights 3 times a week and spent most of them reading. Daniel had sent Terrence's daughter a reference letter for her university application. He walked past the desk with a nod, and Terrence looked up from his book and nodded back. Third floor. His badge worked. The office was exactly as he'd left it that morning. His coffee mug, still unwashed. The framed drawing. The standing desk he never stood at. He turned on his phone's flashlight, rather than the overhead lights. The cable management panel was set into the wall between the monitor mount and the leftmost window. Cream white, plastic, about 18 inches square. He'd opened it maybe twice in 9 years. He opened it now. The cables ran in neat bundles, secured with zip ties every 6 inches, the legacy of someone meticulous who'd worked here before him. He ran the light over them slowly. There. It was smaller than he expected. The size of a matchbox, matte black, sitting in the angle where 2 cable bundles crossed. Magnetic backing. A micro USB port he hadn't recognized at first because it was dressed up to look like a cable terminal. He photographed it. He photographed the panel. He photographed the positioning relative to the cable runs. He did not touch it. He was not an investigator. He was an infrastructure manager. But he knew enough about evidence to know that disturbing it prematurely was how innocent people lost cases. He stood in his dark office for a moment. The device had not just been recording. He knew that from what he'd seen of the exfiltration route. Someone had planted something in the walls of his office that had the capability to intercept, mirror, and relay network traffic. Not a recording device in the conventional sense. Something more sophisticated. Something that turned his office, his credentials, his access, his logged activity into a pipeline that belonged to someone else. A footstep. He heard it before he registered it consciously, the soft compression of the carpet in the hallway outside. He killed the flashlight and was behind the standing desk in one movement, which was the kind of physical reaction that surprised him because he was not a physical reaction kind of man. The footsteps stopped outside his door. 10 seconds. 15. Then they moved on. He stood in the dark of his office for 2 more minutes, breathing steadily, before he left the way he'd come. He didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, another old habit. The kind you acquire when you've learned that the browser history of your thinking can be subpoenaed, and he wrote down everything he knew. The device required physical installation. That meant someone with building access. Someone who could walk down the hall without attracting attention. The exfiltration had used his admin override codes. That was the part that bothered him most. The override code was a secondary authentication factor not stored in the main system, not in any log. He kept it in a password manager that he accessed from exactly one device, his laptop, which lived either at his desk or in his bag, which meant someone had been on his laptop, which meant someone had been in his office without Lily seeing them, or someone had been in his office with Lily seeing them. And that was the man she described. One person doing both things. Or 2 people working together. He wrote the names he knew. Everyone with regular access to his floor. Everyone who knew his schedule. Everyone with a reason. He drew a line through several names quickly. People he understood too well to doubt. People whose motivations were transparent and small. He circled 2. Marcus Webb was the first. Senior architect. Access to most of the same systems Daniel ran. A history of positioning himself adjacent to credit. But Marcus was also comfortable. He was paid well. He liked his life the way it was. The risk-reward calculation didn't fit. The second name he circled was the one that sat in his chest like a splinter. Colin Reyes. Colin had started at Whitmore 8 months ago, brought in as a strategic systems consultant, a vague title that had always struck Daniel as a flag at the recommendation of the CTO, who had since departed the company for reasons Daniel had never been given in full. Colin was young, late 20s, sharp in the way of someone who had spent time learning how to seem sharp. He'd been friendly to Daniel from day one. Genuinely helpful, the kind of colleague who picked up your lunch order without being asked and remembered your daughter's name. Daniel had trusted him. He stared at the name on the legal pad, the admin override. Who else had been near his laptop in the last 3 months? Colin, 3 times. Once to help troubleshoot a driver conflict. Once when Daniel had handed it across the table, during a configuration review. Once he had to think back carefully once, when Daniel had left it unlocked on his desk and stepped into the hallway for a 2-minute conversation. 2 minutes. That was all someone needed, if they knew what they were doing. He wrote a single question on the legal pad. What does Colin want? And then, smaller, underneath it, what is worth $20 million and the destruction of a person's career? He had known Colin for 8 months. He had believed, with the ordinary credulity of a man who has been lied to carefully, that he knew who Colin was. He thought about the lunches, the technical conversations that had felt genuine. The afternoon Colin had stayed late to help Daniel trace an intermittent network fault that had been making the analytics dashboard unreliable. 3 hours of collaborative troubleshooting, patient and methodical. Colin with his sleeves rolled up and his phone face down on the table, in the way of someone choosing to be fully present. That had been real. The competence had been real. The patience had been real. What had not been real was the context in which those things existed. He made a second cup of coffee he didn't drink. He needed to be careful about what came next. He still had his personal laptop, the one he used for freelance work on weekends, which had never touched the Whitmore network. He still had his technical knowledge, and he still had, if he was honest, a stubborn inability to accept a defeat he hadn't caused. He began, cautiously, to reconstruct. He did not hack the Whitmore system. He was very precise about that he accessed nothing. He wasn't authorized to access, touched nothing behind the firewall. What he did was analyze what he already had, the legal copies of his own activity logs that Whitmore's HR policy required to be furnished to employees under investigation, which he had formally requested at 8 a.m., via a certified letter that would arrive, by policy, within 3 business days. While he waited, he did something else. He thought about the exfiltration itself. He was a systems infrastructure manager. He had built parts of the platform that the attacker had used, and what he kept coming back to was not the access that could be spoofed, given the right credentials, but the timing. The exfiltration had happened at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday. Daniel was on call rotation. He rotated with 3 other managers, including Colin. That particular Sunday, he was off rotation. Colin was on. A person conducting a covert exfiltration would, logically, want to do it during a time when legitimate administrative activity was plausible. When someone was expected to be logged in, an on-call engineer doing routine checks would generate exactly that kind of cover. But the session had been attributed to Daniel's credentials. To attribute it to Daniel's credentials and have it be plausible, you needed people to believe that Daniel had logged in remotely on a Sunday night for reasons that made sense. You needed a narrative. You needed, ideally, a recent pattern of unusual activity that would make one more instance unremarkable. He pulled up his phone and looked at his calendar. 3 Sunday nights in the past 6 weeks. He had worked late remotely. Legitimate work patch deployments, migration planning, all of it real, all of it logged, all of it observable by anyone who could read the activity dashboard. Someone had been watching his working patterns. Someone had waited for the right Sunday. The sophistication of it, the patience of it, sat in him like something cold and deliberate. He understood, now, that he wasn't dealing with someone impulsive. He was dealing with someone who had planned this for weeks, someone who had identified him as a target, studied him, used his access, used his office, used the natural cover of his own work habits, used his daughter's Wednesday afternoon at the office. That last part he felt differently than the rest. She told him the rest of it on Thursday morning, not all at once. She was 6. And truth in 6-year-olds emerges in layers, each one revealing itself when the child feels safe enough to go one level deeper. He had learned this about her slowly, over years of small confidences and kitchen table conversations that meandered their way to the thing that actually needed saying. He made her cinnamon toast, which was the good morning toast, the one reserved for weekend mornings and days when something needed to feel okay. She ate 3 bites, and then she said, "The man had a special phone." He set his coffee down. What kind of special phone? It had numbers on the back. She touched the table with one finger, tracing a pattern, like a code. And he kept looking at it while he was in your office. He thought about that. A secondary device. Something running an authentication application, a real-time code generator, which meant the device in the wall hadn't just been passive, it had required active management. Someone had been checking in, maintaining the connection, ensuring the relay was active. Did he talk? He asked. Was he on the phone? Or talking to someone else? She thought about it very seriously, which was the look she got when she was trying to distinguish between what she actually remembered and what she thought she might remember. He said something quiet, she said. Not loud. I only heard a little. What did you hear? She said 3 words. They were, clear for Sunday. He sat very still. She was looking at him carefully. She had her mother's gift for reading a room, and she was reading this one accurately. Is that bad? She said. No, he said. That's exactly right. You remembered exactly right. She had heard a confirmation. A go signal face had been placed and tested, and the operation had been greenlit. Clear for Sunday. 3 weeks before the exfiltration, he knew who had said those words. He had one more thing to do. He called the number at 2 in the afternoon, from his car, parked outside a hardware store. Colin, he said. It's Daniel. A pause. The right kind of pause, not too short, which would have been rehearsed, but not too long, which would have been guilty. Daniel. Hey. I heard about what happened. I'm really sorry, man. I appreciate that. He kept his voice measured. Look, I think there might have been a miscommunication, something with the access logs. I wanted to talk through the timeline with you before I respond to legal. Sure, of course. Can you meet me tonight? Not at the office. Somewhere quiet. Another pause. Shorter this time. Yeah, Colin said. Where? They met at a bar called The Meridian. The kind of place that was almost always half empty on weeknights, booths with high backs. Ambient noise, sufficient to make conversation private. Lighting calibrated for ambiguity. Daniel had chosen it deliberately. He had been in the neighborhood the day before on an errand, and had walked past it twice, noting the entrances, the sightlines, the fact that the booth in the back left corner could not be seen from the door. He was not, he told himself, a man who thought about sightlines. He arrived first. Ordered water. Sat with his jacket on. Because the recording device was in the inside breast pocket, and he did not want to move it. He had tested it 3 times that afternoon. He had tested it once more in the car. It was a simple device, a digital voice recorder he had bought at an electronics store 5 years ago for recording Lily's school performances when his phone ran out of storage. He had been, he thought, too practical and too cheap to ever replace it with something better. He was glad, now, that he hadn't. Colin arrived 12 minutes later, which was also deliberate, late enough to seem unflustered, early enough to seem willing. He ordered a beer. He sat across from Daniel and did the thing that Daniel now recognized as a performance, the open posture, the concerned expression, the patience of a man who had practiced listening. He was, Daniel thought, genuinely talented at it. That was the thing that still sat in him uneasily, not the betrayal exactly, but the craftsmanship of it. The months of careful, patient friendship building that had served as nothing more than operational groundwork. It was the kind of thing that made you wonder what other relationships in your life you had been assigning too much weight. I know it looks bad, Daniel said. The logs. It really does, Colin said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The thing is, Daniel said, I went back to the office last night. Colin's expression did not change, which was its own kind of answer. I found the device in the cable panel. Still nothing. The practiced stillness of a man waiting to see how much was known before deciding what to say. He took a sip of his beer. Set it down. His hands were steady. Daniel noted this and filed it away. I know what it was doing, Daniel said. I know the relay setup. I know the Sunday timing. I know about the phone with the number on the back. A small muscle near Colin's jaw moved. Once. You're making a mistake, Colin said. Very quietly. Tell me about the mistake. And then, whether from genuine arrogance or the calculated assessment that the jig was already up, or perhaps some combination of both that Daniel would never fully understand, Colin told him. Not everything. Not the names of whoever had contracted the data theft. Not the full architecture of the operation. Not the dollar figures he had been promised. But enough. The anger underneath the performance came up in pieces, in the way of a man who was tired of the particular patience his plan had required, and who had perhaps in some interior chamber he kept hidden from himself, wanted someone to see the intelligence of it. He had been hired by someone outside Whitmore. He had been given a target, Daniel. Specifically, because Daniel's access profile was ideal, and because Daniel was isolated enough that a sudden suspension would generate minimal institutional resistance. He had spent 2 months building the false evidence trail. He had spent 1 month observing Daniel's working patterns. The device in the wall had been the final piece. The data was already sold, Colin said. Before they suspended you, there's nothing to recover. I know, Daniel said. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small device on the table between them. Colin looked at it. He understood immediately what it was. The recognition moved across his face in a clean, fast sequence: surprise, calculation, acceptance that compressed itself into something that might, from a distance, have looked like admiration. I've been recording this conversation, Daniel said. Since I parked my car 2 hours ago, the recording was not, on its own, enough. He understood that. A recorded conversation in a bar was not a courtroom confession. There were chain of custody questions, admissibility questions, the general friction of the legal system asserting itself between justice and outcome. But it was enough to change the temperature. He delivered the recording to Harriet Voss at 8 the next morning, along with a 7-page technical analysis he had written at the kitchen table between midnight and 4 a.m. The analysis walked through the device specifications, the relay methodology, the timing correlation with Colin's on-call schedule, and the 3 specific access events that had preceded the exfiltration events that appeared in the activity logs under Daniel's name, but showed latency signatures inconsistent with his home network. Harriet read all 7 pages without speaking. Then she called legal. Then she called Richard. It took 11 days. 11 days of Daniel sitting in his house, making Lily's lunches, dropping her at school, picking her up, helping with the reading worksheet that had a picture of a rabbit and a dog and sentences that needed the missing word filled in. He was functional. He was present. He did not let Lily see the weight of it. The weight was considerable. There were practical worries, the mortgage, the insurance, the cascading financial anxiety of a man who had, since Lily was born, operated without any margin for error. He made spreadsheets at midnight. He researched severance laws. He wrote emails he didn't send to former colleagues, because he wasn't sure yet what he was or wasn't allowed to say. There were less practical worries, too. The ones that arrived at 3 a.m., when the house was quiet and his brain had run out of logistics to process and moved on to the harder material. What people at Whitmore believed about him. What would be said. What it would mean, in the longer run, for his reputation in an industry small enough that word traveled. He had been, for 9 years, a man of uncomplicated professional standing. Not famous, not celebrated, but known, in the quiet way of reliable people, as someone who did what he said he would do. That had been stripped from him in a conference room in about 9 minutes. He sat with that. He also, in the early mornings before Lily woke up, continued working. His personal laptop, his knowledge of systems architecture, the technical analysis that would eventually fill 7 pages. He was meticulous about it, not from some dramatic sense of mission, but because meticulous was what he was. It was how he had always approached things. When Claire left, he had been meticulous about the custody paperwork, about Lily's routines, about maintaining the structures that would keep a small child's life from feeling unstable. When the deployment failed at work, he was meticulous about the incident report. When Lily got sick with a bad fever at 2 in the morning, he was meticulous about the pediatric triage line, the instructions, the right dose, the right interval. Meticulousness was not a virtue, exactly. It was a coping mechanism that happened to be useful. On day 11, Harriet called. The technical analysis had been verified by an external forensic firm. The device had been submitted to the same firm for analysis, and its relay architecture matched exactly what Daniel had described. Colin had, under questioning by legal and in the presence of a law enforcement liaison, confirmed the broad strokes of what he'd said at the Meridian. He was claiming duress. His attorney was positioning it as coercion. None of that was Daniel's problem. Your suspension is lifted, Harriet said. Effective, immediately. Richard wants to speak with you. I know, Daniel said. He had made a decision, somewhere in those 11 days. It had not required much deliberation. Richard's call came an hour later. He expressed regret with the practiced fluency of a man who had given difficult calls his entire career. He mentioned the investigation's outcome. He mentioned reinstatement. He mentioned, carefully, the option of a senior director position that had been in discussion for the previous quarter. Daniel let him finish. I appreciate it, he said. I'm going to decline. Pause. I understand if you need time. I don't need time. I've been thinking about this for 11 days. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to be moving on. He set the phone down and stood in his kitchen and listened to the house. It was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when a child is at school. The particular silence that carries the shape of someone's absence. He had not been fired. He had not been disgraced. He had not, in the end, let anyone take from him the thing that had always been the actual point. This child, this Saturday, this park. He had one more conversation to have. With Harriet, 2 days later, over coffee at a place near the office she had suggested and he had been willing to do. She was, of all the people in that building, the one he respected without reservation. She said, the board wanted you to know that the investigation is ongoing. The external party hasn't been identified yet. That's your problem now, he said. Not unkindly. She nodded. She looked at her coffee. I want to tell you, she said, that the log anomalies you identified, the latency signatures, should have been caught by my team. Yes, he said. They should have been. She nodded again. That's on me. He didn't argue. He didn't soften it for her. She was competent enough to deserve the truth. What he didn't say, what he had thought about in the nights since, was that there was a layer of this story that still wasn't clean. He had been a careful, thorough man his entire career. He had flagged things that needed flagging, built systems with appropriate redundancy, documented everything that should have been documented, and none of it had protected him, because the threat hadn't come through the systems. It had come through the human architecture, through trust and access, and the ordinary vulnerability of a person who believed the people around him were what they appeared to be. He drove home. He started the company in February. Mercer Infrastructure Consulting, which was a name Lily had helped him choose, sitting at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad, crossing out alternatives with a red crayon, and announcing verdicts with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. It sounds strong, she said, of the final option, like a bridge. He put the logo on the website himself. It took 4 hours and 3 cups of coffee and one frustrated phone call to a former colleague who knew about CSS, which was not, he would admit, his strongest domain. The logo ended up being simple. His initials, clean serif font, a thin horizontal line beneath them. Lily looked at it and said it was professional, which she had clearly heard somewhere and was deploying with confidence. The first 2 clients came from former colleagues who had watched what had happened and drawn their own conclusions about where his abilities had always actually sat. By March, there were 4 clients. By April, there were 7. By May, he had turned down 1 engagement because it would have required travel he wasn't willing to do, and that felt, more than the revenue, like evidence that he was operating on his own terms now. He worked from home 3 days a week. The other 2, he rented a desk at a co-working space, 3 blocks from Lily's school, which meant that on Tuesdays and Thursdays he could walk her to school in the morning and be at the corner when she came out in the afternoon. She had started coming to him at pickup with a running narrative of everything that had happened since 8:15, who had said what at lunch, whether the PE teacher had made them do the relay race again, what the book on the classroom shelf had looked like that she wanted to check out. He listened to all of it. He had learned, early in single parenthood, That the content of these reports mattered less than the listening, that what Twilly was doing was not delivering information so much as checking, repeatedly, that he was there, that the channel was open, that the connection was maintained. He was there. She had stopped being quiet at breakfast. He noticed this in the particular way you notice the absence of something you had stopped consciously registering. The kitchen was louder in the mornings. She talked about her friend Priya's dog, which had eaten an entire sock and survived. She talked about the book about dolphins she had checked out from the library, which claimed that dolphins called each other by name, individual signature whistles, and which had prompted her to spend an evening trying to teach Gerald the succulent to respond to his name by speaking to him in different tones, which had not worked but which she remained optimistic about. She talked about the dream she'd had in which all the houses in their neighborhood were actually boats, and the boathouses had to be re-steered every morning so their front doors faced the sun. He made her eggs and listened to all of it. One Saturday in early May, they went to the park, a different one, farther from the house, the kind that had a real slide and climbing equipment with enough challenge to be worth the 20-minute drive. He watched her at the top of the climbing structure, arms out, deciding whether to jump to the net below. She jumped. She landed and scrambled up and went to the top again, immediately, the way children do when something works. He sat on the bench with his hands around a paper cup of coffee and felt, in the particular cellular way that things sometimes arrive after a long time, that he was okay. Not fine in the way of someone performing fineness. Actually okay. The kind of okay that doesn't announce itself but just settles quietly into your body one morning and stays. He had not been fired. He had not been disgraced. He had not, in the end, let anyone take from him the thing that had always been the actual point: this child, this Saturday, this park. She came to him at some point, flushed from running, and climbed onto the bench beside him. "Daddy," she said, "are you happy?" He looked at her. He thought about the honest answer, which was complicated in the way of most honest answers, involving several things he could not explain to a 6-year-old: relief, and residual anger, and something that might be called gratitude for the version of things he'd ended up in, as opposed to the version that had been planned for him. The version where he had accepted the narrative, where the evidence had been sufficient, and his protests had dissolved under the weight of log files and legal language, where he had spent 6 months fighting a case he couldn't afford, and Lily had grown up in a household shaped by that particular, grinding fear. That version had been close. Closer than he liked to hold in his mind. He said, "Yeah, Lily. I really am." She seemed satisfied by this and climbed off the bench and ran back to the climbing structure. He watched her. There was something he had tried to find the right moment to say for 3 months. He had rehearsed versions of it in the car, in the shower, during the long quiet hours at the kitchen table in the first weeks. He had tried the version that was formal and grateful, and the version that was casual and deflective, and the version that was simply honest in the way that honesty sometimes has no shape at all. None of the versions were right. None of them were big enough. When she came back for juice from his bag, breathing hard and happy, he said, simply, "You know you saved me." She looked at him with those gray eyes, considered it. "I know," she said, matter of fact. "Then, you would have figured it out." "Maybe," he said, "but not the same way. Not in time." She nodded, accepting this, and reached into his bag for the juice box. He helped her with the straw. They stayed for another hour. The afternoon light was the particular gold of early May, long and slanted, the kind that makes ordinary things look like they're worth remembering. He pushed her on the swings until his arms ached. She found a dog that its owner let her pet, a large and undignified golden retriever that lay down in the middle of the path and refused to get up, absorbing the attention of every passerby as though it were its natural due. Lily sat cross-legged beside it and told it, seriously and at some length, about the dolphin book. He laughed for the first time in a while. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest. On the way home, she fell asleep in the back seat, one hand still curled around the empty juice box, head tipped against the window. The late light caught the side of her face. She had 3 freckles on her nose that had appeared sometime in the last year, and that he sometimes forgot about and then remembered. He drove carefully. The kind of careful you learn when something small and irreplaceable is in the car with you. He was pulling into the driveway when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message. You should know there were others involved. Not just Reyes. The data buyer has connections you haven't considered yet. Stay careful, D. He stared at the message for a long time. No sender, no follow-up. The number, when he tried to call it back 30 seconds later, was disconnected. He sat in the car after Lily woke up and went inside. He sat there while the May evening came down around the neighborhood, the streetlights clicking on one by one. A neighbor walking a small terrier up the sidewalk without looking at his phone, which struck Daniel, in this particular moment, as a form of grace. He thought about what it meant and what he would do next, and whether the quiet that had begun to accumulate in his life was real or just an interval. Then he went inside. He made dinner pasta, because Thursday was always pasta. And he had decided, in the reorganization of his life, to keep the rhythms that had held. The reliable small structures. He read to Lily before bed the Dolphin book, which was more detailed than he'd expected, and which led to a 12-minute conversation about whether dolphins had names for each other, which she had read somewhere, and which he confirmed was true, and which prompted a long silence in which she appeared to be reconsidering something fundamental about the nature of the world. Do they miss each other? She said finally. When they get separated? He thought about it. I think probably yes, he said. She thought about that too. That's sad, she said. Then, but also good. Because it means they know who they are to each other. He looked at her. He could not always tell, with Lily, whether she was talking about dolphins. He turned her light out at 8:30 and stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her the way he always did the small architecture of her breathing. The nightlight making a warm circle on the wall, Gerald the succulent on the windowsill, still nameless from the dolphin's perspective. The message sat in his phone downstairs. He was not a man who ran from things. He was also not a man who let them ruin the 8:30 light, the Dolphin book, the hand on the straw. He would think about it in the morning. Tonight, he went to bed,